Okay, everybody, welcome. My name is Freya Dawson, and I've been a home educator for a long time now. I have two sons, and my eldest son is 18, and my youngest son is 14, and they've been home educated their whole lives. Well, except my eldest son is now in high school. He's in year 12, but my youngest son is still at home. So it's been a very long and very interesting homeschooling journey for us. And I have done a lot of deschooling in the process of that. So that's what the topic of today's webinar is going to be. It's going to be about deschooling and what that has meant for me over that long period of home education. And it's probably meant different things at different times of that period. So I'm just going to introduce by talking about the homeschooling journey that I've had, and then I'll talk about what I call the school mindset and how that came into the picture in quite a big way, and then the tool that I used to question my thinking and to dissolve that school mindset and to dissolve a huge amount of stress in my life. So I guess starting from the beginning, I have a very schooly background because I come from an academic family. My dad was a university professor and my mum taught at university, and I had a university education myself, and I taught at university as well before I had children. So it was a very academic environment. Obviously, the academic side was very, very highly valued in my family. In fact, it was sort of like the most important thing of anything. And then I had kids quite late, so I already had a career. I was already teaching. I had my eldest son when I was 35, and it changed everything, obviously, in my life, having a child. But it changed everything even more dramatically when he got to about 4 years old, and he basically refused to go to preschool anymore. He had been enrolled in preschool and had enjoyed it, but it had always been quite stressful for him. And he'd started to have like really big meltdowns after preschool and like refusing to go to preschool, and it was getting very stressful. So when he was about 4.5, he just refused to go anymore. And I was sort of thinking, well, what do I do now? You know, I can't get him into preschool. I can't get him to go to preschool. How's he going to fit into a school environment? And at that point in time, I was really fortunate to meet some homeschoolers, and they introduced me to this other way of educating children. And that was very exciting because all of a sudden I had another option. I just couldn't imagine how my son was going to fit into mainstream school. And I looked at Montessori and Steiner and all those other alternative options, and I couldn't see how he was going to fit in there either, because he really valued his autonomy. He just wanted to do everything in his own time and in his own way. And he was also experiencing quite a lot of challenges at that time in his life, because he would have these explosive meltdowns and very, very intense emotions and night terrors, and all sorts of stuff were going on for him, which were really challenging to deal with for me and for the family. So when we discovered home education, it just like was a relief in a way, because there was another option for us to educate our son. But there were also huge challenges there for me because I just didn't know how it was going to work. I had absolutely no idea. I hadn't thought about home education. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know how it worked. So I was on this really, really steep learning curve about home education. And eventually I came to understand that it was going to be an unlearning curve, because I was going to have to unlearn just about everything I knew about education in order for this to work. But I didn't really know that at the beginning. I was just like, okay, home education, what is it? I'm going to research it. I'm going to read all this stuff. I'm going to talk to people and I'm going to find out how to do it. So the early years weren't particularly stressful in terms of the school mindset, because we just played, and I had another son who there's a 4-year gap, and so I had 2 kids, and there was a lot of play. There was a lot of watching documentaries and playing in the park and in the back garden and talking about all sorts of stuff. And, you know, they were really interested in a whole lot of different things. And it looked like home education was, you know, exciting and fun, and it wasn't going to be difficult for them to absorb all this amazing information, and they were curious. And then when my eldest son turned 6, there were some challenges started, because even though it seemed to be working really well for us, I also hadn't told my parents about it, because I thought that they would really disapprove of the whole idea of home education, given their academic backgrounds. And so I'd put it off as long as possible to tell them about home education. And I was right. They did hate the idea, and they were strongly opposed to the idea of homeschooling or any sort of home education, and they were not at all backward in telling me about their opposition. So that was a bit of a drama. And at around about the same time, when my eldest was 6, that's when he went to a friend's house and was introduced to video games. And he fell in love straight away. He played this game at his friend's house a few times, and then that's all he could talk about. All he could think about was, I want a gaming console, I want to play video games. So we got him a gaming console, and that became his passion for, well, really a long time, 10 years. To be honest, it was about 10 years that was his number one passion, was video gaming. And his little brother was also obviously exposed to video games from a very early age, and he was passionate about it too. He started playing when he was about 3 and was really into it when he was, 4 and 5. And so I was at this stage reading everything I could still about home education and how it worked, and I'd realised that given how my kids were and their absolute passion for doing what they wanted to do, they hated to be pushed, they hated to be told what to do. They loved gaming, they loved, playing. They weren't interested in bookwork or sitting down at a desk or anything like that, really. So I'd figured out by that stage that unschooling was probably what would suit us, our style, our family. That was probably really the only way for us to go, because my sons just refused to do formal bookwork. I had a whole pile of workbooks and all sorts of resources, everything you could imagine. The house was stuffed full. But really what they wanted to do was play with Lego, play video games, play in the park with friends, just have fun and play. and have lots of conversations and all the rest of it. So they were learning lots, but it didn't look anything like schooling. And now that my son was school aged, that became more of an issue. So that sort of became our way of being, was an unschooling lifestyle. And I supported my sons to play and to engage with the video games and to engage with all the things that they really love to do. And at the same time, I was getting regular lectures from my parents, who were extremely concerned about my children not learning and not going to school and not appearing to learn what they were supposed to be learning at that age. And the interesting thing was that I found myself reacting to my parents' disapproval and their anxiety and all the stories that they were coming out with about their fears for my sons and their education. And when I realised that my reactions and my defensiveness was because I was actually believing some of this stuff too. You know, I had fears and I was getting stressed and anxious. And some of the things that my parents were saying, which were also bubbling up in my thinking, were things like, you know, I remember my mother saying, oh, there are some things you just have to be taught. And she would go on about that there's a window for learning certain things. And if you miss this window, then, you know, you might never learn that particular skill. And the focus of all this was around reading and writing, predominantly in relation to my eldest son. So she would also say things like, you know, there are some things you just have to do, or you have to learn whether you like it or not. So she was pushing me to push my children to actually sit them down and try and teach them some you know, basic skills, what she considered basic skills: reading, writing, maths. And she was completely really scared, you know, and really anxious that I wasn't doing that. The other thing, you know, she would constantly compare my children's apparent lack of progress or lack of learning with her other grandchildren. And of course, this comparison is part of the school mindset. It's like you're supposed to learn along with your peers and be at a certain level at a certain age. And if you're not, then you're falling behind and you're failing. And there was this overall concern that she had that that I was actually, you know, that I could fail at this whole home education thing. And, you know, it could be a failure. I could fail my children and they just never would learn the basic skills that they needed. And this was like the worst nightmare scenario as far as my parents were concerned. And I realized that there were a lot of, you know, a lot of those same fears were coming up in my head. And as the years went on, it didn't really calm down, because the years went on and my sons didn't just learn to read. You know, I'd done a lot of reading about home education, and I was aware that in particular boys often read later, learn to read later, same with writing. So I knew it was you know, it was likely to happen later than it might in school, but it just didn't happen. You know, they didn't show an interest in learning to read or write. They didn't show an interest in sitting down with any sort of maths books or any workbooks at all. I mean, they were learning a lot of maths just through day-to-day life, and they were learning words and the alphabet, and we would play with words and language, and I would read to them all the time. So there was a huge amount going on, but it didn't look like they were actually learning to read or write. So there was a lot of conflict with the school mindset, and it was sort of manifest in this conflict between what was going on in my head and my parents, and the, you know, pretty much regular sort of downloads of their anxiety and their concerns and their really, really strong opposition to what I was doing. So it sort of really came to a head round about when my eldest son was around about 9 or 10, and he still hadn't learnt to read or write. And he became aware then that he was different to his peers. You know, he joined the Cub Scouts and he had lots of friends, so he knew that they could read and he couldn't, and he started to get stressed about it too. But I think that was largely because he was picking up the messages from his grandparents and from discussions around the home, you know, why isn't this happening, sort of thing. So at around about that time, that was actually when I discovered this teacher, Byron Katie, and what she calls self-inquiry, or the work. So I was feeling pretty desperate at this stage, because I was really stressed and there was a lot of conflict, and I needed a way to sort of sort it out within myself. And this work, this thing, self-inquiry, promised to be a way of examining what I was thinking and believing and getting a different perspective, and actually dissolving some of that old belief system, the school mindset. So I was really, really fascinated when I came across it, and there's lots and lots of YouTube videos that Byron Katie does where she goes through these questions with people on any sort of thought they have that's stressful for them or that's causing some sort of conflict for them. She asks them these questions and the answers come up from within them. So it's actually all about finding your own truth, finding your deepest truth, and getting a different perspective on what you're actually thinking. And you can apply it to just about any aspect of your life, any relationship, any situation that's causing you stress. But of course, I really needed something to deal with the situation with home education, and I needed something to help me do this deschooling thing. So I ended up applying her process, the work, to the stressful thoughts that I was having about my son and him not learning to read. So I'm going to use that as an example to show you how this process works. So I'm actually going to use the thought I had was, my child should have learned to read and write by now. So that was the thought that was in my head when my son was around 9 or 10. And also I had all sorts of other thoughts, you know, that I should be doing more, that he isn't learning enough. But to illustrate how this process works, I'm just going to take that one thought and I'm going to step you through a series of questions. So I'm actually going to show how I would do it myself. So I'm going to ask the questions of myself and give you the answers just that came up for me, so that you can see how the process how the process works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up the questions on the screen, if I can work out how to do that. And then I'm going to go through them in relation to this thought, my child should have learned to read by now. So let's see if I can get this to work. Yes, here we go. There. So I'm doing the work on this thought, my child should have learned to read and write by now. And the first question that I ask myself is that true? And it's just a simple yes or no to that. Is it true? Well, I don't know. When I asked myself that question, I really didn't know whether it was true that he should have learned to read and write by now. The second question is, can you absolutely know it's true that your child should have learned to read and write by now? And when I really went inside and found my deepest truth, it was no. I couldn't absolutely know it was true that my child should have learnt to read and write by now. So you just sit with that for a moment. No, I can't absolutely know. The third question has a few parts to it, but it is, how do you feel when you believe that thought? So when I believed the thought, my child should have learnt to read and write by now, well, I felt really, really stressed and really anxious. It was like I imagined there were images coming up of a future in which, you know, my child still couldn't read when he was 15, 18, 20, you know, that it was actually this sort of disastrous scenario of real difficulty for him and real difficulty for me. I would imagine all the judgment that would come down on me from my parents if you know, I believe he should have learnt to read and write right now, then, you know, it's this future scenario. This is going to continue. And there was a lot of self-judgment around that as well. You know, I'm not good enough at this. I haven't done enough, or I've done the wrong thing. So there was all sorts of really painful feelings arose around that thought that he should have learnt to read and write by now. Stress, anxiety, self-judgment, and this movie going in my head of this really difficult future. So another part of this question is, how do you treat your child when you believe that thought? And I'm sure you can put yourself in a situation here and ask yourself, you know, how you respond when you believe a thought like that. You can probably well imagine what happened with my child was that I put pressure on them. I put pressure on my son to learn to read, and this led to conflict between us. You know, I started pushing him to read more things and to read these words or that book, and I gave him the message that he should have been able to do this by now. So the stressful thought that was in my head leaked out, and it leaked out as a judgment of him. You should be able to do this by now. And of course he felt the judgment, and he felt that very deeply. And it was very painful for him that I had actually judged that he should have been able to do this, and he couldn't. So now, because I've put this story on my son, he now thinks he has a problem. And I think he has a problem. So I'm telling him he has a problem. So whereas he didn't have a problem before, now he has a problem. And I also found myself making assumptions about him as well. So these were sort of judgments like, you're not really trying hard enough, or you should be trying harder. So I was basically judging him for not having learnt to read. And that created conflict, and it created quite a painful situation between my son and I. So all this did, this belief in relation to my child, was it made him react to me pushing him. So he pushed back, he felt bad. And of course, the conflict and him feeling bad about himself and suddenly feeling like he had a problem, it gets in the way of learning. Really, that was the biggest result of all of this, is that now there isn't an ideal environment for learning, because the ideal environment for learning is one that's relaxed and playful and stress-free, and we didn't have that now in our house, or not all the time anyway. So it was getting in the way of his learning. So another part of this question is, how do you treat yourself when you believe that thought? So when I believed the thought, my child should have learned to read and write by now, and they hadn't, well, again, the self-judgment came in, and the really the guilt feelings, the stress, the anxiety, you know, it really exhausted me just thinking about it. So the more exhausted I became, and the more stressed I became about this, then obviously the less available I was for my children, and less available to support and help their learning. So that's what happens. Well, that's what happened to me when I believed that thought. My child should have learned to read and write by now. So question 4 asks, who would you be without that thought? And this is a really, really important question. This is really the heart of this whole process. So it asks you to sort of put that thought aside and imagine yourself with your child without that thought. How would you be with your child if you didn't have that thought, they should have learnt to read and write by now? So when I went within myself to find that space where I was with my child without that thought, I found that when I wasn't thinking that, I was actually there to support, to engage, just to be relaxed, to play with my children, to be really available for my son, and to listen to him, you know, to actually see how he really was, you know, to listen to his perspective and to support him, and to support him learning in a way that really suited him. So when I didn't have that thought, he should have learnt to read and write by now, I was actually more available, more relaxed, and able to actually help him find his unique style of learning. And I also didn't feel bad about myself. So it's actually a lovely space to be in. Once that thought, he should have learnt to read and write, and that whole school mindset starts to fall away, it's just this relaxed, enjoyable process. Learning is fun, and learning with your children and supporting their learning is fun. If there's not this horrible, stressful story getting in the way. So I've used these questions. I've used these questions in not just in relation to my children learning to read and write. I've also used them in relation to a whole lot of other areas of my parenting life and our homeschooling journey. So I use them a lot to question the gaming thing. You know, there were so many questions came up around that, because my children were so passionate about gaming, and they wanted to play all sorts of games, you know, that really stretched my boundaries, and I was on a hugely steep learning curve there. So there was a whole lot of questions about how much they were gaming, you know, whether it was good for them or bad for them or all that sort of stuff. And I used this process to help me question my thoughts about gaming. My children have also experienced, as I said at the beginning, some very intense emotions, emotional outbursts of swearing and hitting and angry reactions. And so I've used these questions to work out, to look at my thoughts around my children's behaviour, and to come to a much, much more peaceful place in relation to their behaviour as well, and how I can support them through their own emotional difficulties. I've used it around food. I've used it around issues around chores, you know, mess, cleaning, all that sort of stuff, and all of the different aspects of the school mindset, not just about when you learn to read, but, you know, how learning happens, and whether you need to learn any particular thing at a particular time, how important different parts of the curriculum are, whether workbooks are necessary, whether learning to write has to happen at a particular time. You know, so many different aspects of this, and you can pick out individual thoughts, and you can ask yourself these questions to get a new perspective, to see how the thoughts are actually creating the stress and the struggle and the conflict in your family, and what it's like without the thought. And just getting that different perspective can make a huge difference in the whole process. But it's not, this skill of doing the work and questioning your thinking is not the only tool I've used for deschooling. I think I've mentioned I also read a lot, and I've followed lots of Facebook groups, and you know, I've basically absorbed all I could about people's experiences as home educators and how it was for them. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to share this with you, is that it's hearing other people's stories that really made a difference to me, in addition to doing this questioning process that I called the work. And there were other skills I had to learn as well to make this whole process really sustainable for our family. I had to learn how to speak differently to my children so that we didn't end up in conflict all the time. And we had to learn problem-solving processes so we could work out, you know, our conflicting wants in different situations. So there's a whole lot of different aspects, new skills, if you like, that I learned while I was home educating to make our lives sustainable, fun and joyful, and to support my children in a way that they needed and suited their particular temperaments. And it's all actually worked out really, really well. You might be curious to know when my sons actually did finally learn to read. They both can read, which is cool. It turned out that my eldest son is actually dyslexic. And I figured this out when he was about 11 or so, and he still hadn't learned to read. And I read lots of books about dyslexia, and I talked to him, and we went and saw a couple of professionals about it, and he started a program to help him learn to read and to write, do his handwriting. But after about 3 months, he just said, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't enjoy it. You know, I don't want to hear about any more programs or any more books or processes or anything. I just want to do this in my own way. In my own time, which was just so like him, because that's how we ended up going on this unschooling journey to start with was because he always wanted to do things in his own way and his own time. So I sort of took a really deep breath and said, okay, you do it in your own way, in your own time. And he did. He went off and continued to play video games as his number one passion, and he taught himself to read playing video games. I don't even know when it happened. I just know that by the age of 15, he could read. He could read everything he needed to read. So it worked for him. And my other son, who's now 14, he's not dyslexic, but he also was, late to learn to read. He just wasn't interested in learning to read. And it probably wasn't until he was about 12 that he really, really decided. He applied himself. He was almost like he woke up one day and said, no, I want to learn to read now. And it became a major focus for him. And he was quite different because he actually wanted to be taught how to read. So one son wanted to do it entirely on his own and work it out all himself. And my other son wanted me to sit down and teach him how to read. And that's how he's learnt to read. He wanted me to teach him in a very sort of, using phonics and workbooks and sitting down at a desk and writing things out and reading out loud. And it's been a very intensive process, but it's worked for him. So very, very different learning styles, very different approaches. I've just adapted to what has suited them and their timing and their particular way of learning. And it's worked really well. And it hasn't been stressful because it's actually just like an organic process that unfolds. But if I do get stressed, I know I can come back to these questions of the work, and I can ask those questions. Is it true? Can I absolutely know it's true, this stressful thought? And how do I feel when I believe that thought? And examine and investigate how it affects my life and my relationships. And then ask, who would I be without that thought? How would my life be if I didn't have that belief? So it's been a really, really valuable process, and it's been a really, really interesting journey. And I've actually written a book about it in that process because I needed to sort of talk about this with my friends and my fellow homeschooled mums, and we read lots of books together, and we worked out what was really working for us, what was going to support us in our homeschool journey. And I put that all together into a book, including my stories of how it all evolved for me. And it's also now a course. The book is called Joyful Parenting, and the course is my Joyful Parenting course. And it includes this process for questioning your thinking and all the other skills that I've learned: problem solving, communication, listening skills, playing skills. So I'm just going to give you some more information before I open it up for questions about, here we go. Oh, no, let's just get rid of that. Here we go. So my Joyful Parenting course, I've actually got it starting in Wollongong on the 5th of June. That's next Wednesday. But I also run it online using this Zoom platform, and I'll probably have a course starting in July. I haven't got a date for that yet. So if you're interested, send me an email or a message, and I'll give you the details when I actually set the date for that online course. Now, if you're interested in what I've been talking about today, I've got lots of free articles on my website. I've also got my Joyful Parenting book, and I do one-on-one coaching with parents to help resolve these issues If you're particularly worried or stressed about a particular issue relating to home education or anything to do with parenting at all, then I can help you go through the process of the work and coach you to really be a much more relaxed parent and to have a really peaceful life with your children. So please get in touch. Go to my website, send me an email, let me know if I can support you in your homeschooling journey. And now I would really like to open it up to questions. Excuse me. So I'll just see if we've got any questions here in the chat. And we've got a Q&A question here. So, okay, from Elaine. Would the delay in learning how to read for both your boys make learning more difficult, mainly because they needed you to read whatever written resource you explored? Did it deter their search for information when they're interested in something? No, I didn't find it delayed their reading at all, actually. I did read for them quite a lot, but that was actually a wonderful learning experience, because then we could talk about whatever it was I was reading for them, and we could discuss it. So a lot of their learning was what I call conversational learning. You know, I would read and then we would talk, and then they would ask questions and I would read some more. So there was a lot of really, really in-depth conversations where we explored their interests in depth and followed leads and looked for all sorts of other sources of information. So I helped them find information, but they also found it themselves. They've both used YouTube extensively and they've talked to friends, and they've learned through gaming, and they've learned through travel and excursions and all sorts of things. So they found stuff on YouTube entirely independently. Even when they couldn't read, they worked out how to find the information that they were after. So I don't think it held back their learning at all, actually. But, you know, that's just my experience, and it's sort of a bit of a hypothetical question, because I don't know how they would have learnt other than the way they actually did learn. But they, yeah, okay, that's, I think, all I can say about that. Okay. Yes, Elaine says, what's your web address? Yes, I will put that up again on the screen at the end of the webinar. So a question from Brid. I'm wondering if you can share any information about homeschooling and unschooling my two autistic boys, age 8.5 and nearly 5. Well, I don't have any information specifically about that, Brid, but I do know a lot of parents who are homeschooling children on the spectrum. In fact, some close friends of mine have children on the spectrum, and there's a lot of parents and children in our homeschool community here in the Illawarra who are doing that. So it seems to be the case that homeschooling, and in particular unschooling, really suit some of these children. And some need some structure, some really like the less structured environment where they're not being pushed. They're not being pushed, there's less conflict, you know. If they have difficulties with anxiety, and both of my children have had issues with anxiety from time to time. Any situation where they're not being pushed or forced, or there's not conflict or pressure around the learning, is much better for the child. The less pressure, the less conflict, the more relaxed environment, the more playful the learning environment can be, the more likely your children are to relax and enjoy learning. that's been my experience, and it's been the experience I've witnessed with my friends' children. So I hope that information is helpful to you. Annie asks, how do you go about recording your kids' learning so you can prove they are learning for the authorities, i.e. the Education Department or Homeschooling Register in Victoria here? Yes, well, that is an issue, obviously. We're in New South Wales, but there's similar recording requirements. Basically, the process has been of me translating what my children do in their everyday lives, including on video games, including YouTube, including watching documentaries, including all the conversations we have, taking notes in relation to all that and translating all of that material into the language of the school curriculum. So that's been my job, is actually taking notes and, you know, like I kept a diary of conversations and games and videos and all sorts of stuff that my children were engaging with and learning from. And then I got the school curriculum and I went through it and I basically translated what they were learning into the educational language, and I ticked the relevant boxes to show their learning. In relation to their late reading, what we have in New South Wales is a situation where you can actually register for like primary studies rather than include your child in a particular year level. So if you can demonstrate, if you register for primary studies, for example, and you demonstrate that your child is learning, then it doesn't matter whether they're not learning at the same level as their peers in all subject areas. So they can be at like a stage 1 level in reading, that's like kindergarten or first class, and then they can be learning geography or science at a, you know, year 4, 5 or 6 level. And that's in fact what was happening with my children. They were learning upper primary school science and geography and all sorts of other things, history, maths, but they were still back in like stage 1 in some aspects of their reading and writing. So I just put all that in my homeschool report, and I said, well, stage 1 here and stage 2 there and stage 4 here, and they were spread out across a whole spectrum of stages, but they were actually learning in all those areas, and I could demonstrate that they were learning in all those areas, and that was fine. That was absolutely fine with the authorised person here in New South Wales, and we have been registered for many years now. So that was fine. It's just a matter of translating into the educational language. Melissa says, I'm wanting to homeschool and unschool next year. Is there time frames that things like reading need to be learned by? Well, again, this relates to the requirements of particular states, and certainly states can vary in their requirements. But in New South Wales, the situation is you need to show that your children are learning, you need to show that you're supporting their learning and that they have learning resources and learning opportunities, but your child is not assessed for where they're actually up to. Like, they don't get assessed, it's the parent who gets assessed. It's the parent who has to show that they're providing the learning environment and the learning opportunities. So you don't get into trouble if your child is a late reader. If you can demonstrate you're supporting their reading and they're learning at their own pace and in their own way, my experience has been that that's been fine. So there is no cut-off date or time frame that they have to actually learn to read. And also, at the same time, my boys were not actually, formally reading. They were still engage with lots of other aspects of the English curriculum. So they were composing stories. They were actually, with my assistants, they were writing stories, they were writing cartoons, they were dictating stuff to me, they were writing lists, they were absorbing a lot in terms of audio books and movies and having books read to them. So there was an enormous amount of learning going on from the English syllabus, just not that little bit about independent reading for quite a while. Okay, over to questions here from Elise. Did you follow any particular structure or rhythm to your day, or did you simply follow their lead by the moment? Well, that has changed over time. Probably for most of the decade that they were gaming as their main activity, there wasn't a particular structure to the day. They would get up, have breakfast, and hop on their computers. That's usually what happened. Unless we were going out, or there was some outing planned, or we were going to the beach, or to visit relatives, or something, you know. We were very flexible generally. So we didn't have a particular structure in terms of this happens at this particular time, but there was a certain rhythm to the days, and that has remained the case. It's just adapted. So now the rhythm, you know, now my 14-year-old son is very, very keen on sitting down and doing formal homeschooling, formal bookwork. So, you know, the rhythm is he wakes up, has breakfast, and we sit down and start doing geography or history or English or whatever it is. And then, you know, we just basically, it's still pretty much led by him, but that's what he wants to do now. So it's flexible, but I have found that certain rhythms have developed. So, a question from Elaine. How much time should we expect to spend translating their learning for reporting purposes? Well, to be honest, I haven't spent that much time. In New South Wales, we only have to, it depends how long you get registered for. You usually start with about a year, and you can go up to 2 years. So I was fortunate enough to get 2 years. And basically I would put in a fair bit of effort leading up to my next registration period. So a couple of months before my registration was going to expire, I would put in a considerable effort to translating the learning and reporting process and going through the curriculums and doing up a big report and a big folder of material. So it was sporadic, because then we'd have our assessment, you know, the authorised person would come and we'd be assessed, and we'd get another 2 years, and basically then I could kind of ignore it for quite a while until the next assessment came around. So are there any other questions? Let me see. Does anybody have any other questions before we finish up? Here we go. Lauren, could you tell me more about the strategies you applied when you experienced pushback and meltdowns? And could you expand on your key strategies, observations used in maintaining peace? Yes, I could tell you more about that. The strategies I applied when I experienced pushback and meltdowns was to do this process of questioning my thinking. So to actually investigate what I was thinking in that moment. And generally, there was pushback and meltdowns because I was pushing. So pushback happens because I was pushing, and And I was pushing because I was believing these thoughts about he should have learned to read, or he should be doing more, or I should be doing more. You know, it's these stressful thoughts about what should be happening that was causing me to put pressure on my children, that was causing the pushback and the meltdowns. I mean, that wasn't the only cause of meltdowns, but it was one big factor. So my strategy was to investigate my own thinking and to question my thoughts. And once I got a different perspective and I could see how it was my thoughts were causing the stress and the conflict, not the situation with my child, then I stepped back. So I stopped pushing because I could see that it was my thoughts that were causing the problem. And without my thoughts, there wasn't a problem. So I relaxed and I stepped back, and the pushback and the meltdowns started to dissolve. So that was my main strategy. And in terms of maintaining peace, again, it was questioning my thinking. It was a process of learning how to listen to my children when they were upset and to hear the emotions underneath their upset words rather than reacting to the words that they were speaking. To learn how to speak to them without judging them and without blaming them. To ask for what I wanted and what I wanted help with without blame or judgment. That was a really important part. And to also involve them in a process of problem solving when we had a conflict over cleaning or bedtimes or food or whatever, that we had a process of problem solving where we could all work it out together to find solutions that everybody was happy with. And that's worked brilliantly for our family. So there are a whole lot of different elements to this process, and that's what I talk about on the articles in my website, and that's what my book is about. It's about that whole process and the different strategies I've used. So there's a lot of information there to go into more detail what I've just been sharing. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. Yep. So I want to say thank you very, very much for joining me today and asking your questions. And I hope it's been helpful for you. I hope it will help you relax and really, really enjoy your home education journey. And if I can be of support in that, I'd love to hear you. I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions you have in the Facebook forums, and also feel welcome to contact me via my website, which is www.freyadawson.com.au. So thank you very much. Good night.